Breaking right now. The United States Secretary of Defense just admitted he does not want this war to end. Pete Hegseth, the man commanding American military operations across the Middle East, the officer overseeing the bombing of Iran and the deployment of thousands of U.S. troops, stood in front of reporters at the Pentagon this morning and said he is disappointed by the prospect of a ceasefire. Disappointed, not relieved, not grateful that negotiations might prevent more American deaths. Disappointed because Pete Hegseth wants the war to continue. And when asked about Hegseth's statement, President Donald Trump smiled and said, "I love that attitude. Pete knows we need to finish the job. That is the kind of thinking that wins wars." Trump praised his defense secretary for wanting more war, not less, more. This is day 28 of a conflict that has killed 13 American soldiers, wounded 290 more, devastated 2 countries, killed over 3,000 civilians, paralyzed global shipping, spiked energy prices, and brought the world closer to a broader regional war than at any point since 1991. And the U.S. Secretary of Defense is disappointed that it might end. Let me explain what this admission reveals, not just about Hegseth, but about the entire U.S. strategy in this war. Because what Hegseth said out loud is what many officials have been thinking privately for weeks. The war is not going according to plan. Iran has not collapsed. The regime has not surrendered. And ending the war now through negotiations would mean admitting that maximum pressure failed, that 28 days of relentless bombing did not achieve the stated objectives, that the United States launched the most intense air campaign in modern history and still could not force Iran to its knees. So Hegseth wants to keep fighting, not because continuing the war will produce a better outcome, but because stopping now would reveal that the outcome so far is a failure. Start with what Hegseth actually said, because his exact words matter. The Pentagon press briefing began normally. Hegseth provided updates on military operations, number of sorties flown, targets struck, munitions expended, standard operational details. Then a reporter asked, "Mr. Secretary, there are reports that Pakistan is mediating negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. Some officials suggest a ceasefire could be announced within days. What is your assessment?" Hegseth paused, looked at his notes, then looked directly at the camera and said, "I will be honest with you. I am disappointed by the ceasefire prospect. We have Iran on the ropes. Their military is degraded. Their leadership is in disarray. Their economy is collapsing. This is the moment to apply maximum pressure and force unconditional surrender, not the moment to negotiate a settlement that allows the regime to survive and rebuild. If we stop now, we will be back here in 5 years fighting the same war. I believe we should continue operations until Iran has no choice but to accept our terms completely." The room went silent. Reporters looked at each other shocked because the Secretary of Defense just publicly opposed peace negotiations, just admitted he wants the war to continue despite the costs, despite the casualties, despite the global economic damage, because ending the war now would not be victory, it would be compromise. And Hegseth does not want compromise. He wants total victory, unconditional surrender, complete regime collapse, the same goals that have eluded the United States in every Middle East war for the past 30 years, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. Every time the U.S. set impossible victory conditions, and every time the result was either stalemate or withdrawal without achieving those goals. But Hegseth believes Iran will be different, that more bombing will produce the breakthrough, that more time will bring the regime to its knees, that walking away from negotiations now will somehow force Iran to surrender later. It is delusional and it is dangerous. Because here is what he is not saying. The war is not going well, not for the United States, not for Israel, and definitely not for the civilians caught in the crossfire. Yes, the U.S. has struck over 10,000 targets. Yes, 2/3 of Iran's weapons factories are destroyed. Yes, Iran's air defenses are shattered, but Iran is still fighting. Iran launched over 5,000 missiles and drones since the war began. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz and crippled global shipping. Iran activated proxy forces across the region. Iran killed 13 American soldiers and wounded 290 more. And Iran's government has not collapsed. Supreme Leader Mojtaba Kameh is still in power. The IRGC still functions. The security apparatus still enforces control. Iran is hurt, but Iran is not defeated. And that is the problem HG faces because the original war aims were regime change and the complete dismantling of Iran's military capability. But after 28 days of the most intense bombing in modern history, the regime is still intact and Iran is still capable of fighting. So if negotiations happen now, the U.S. has to accept something less than total victory, has to acknowledge that Iran survived maximum pressure, has to admit that military force alone cannot achieve the political objectives. And that admission is unacceptable to Pete Hegseth, so he wants to keep bombing, keep fighting, keep hoping that eventually, if enough targets are struck and enough time passes, Iran will break. But there is no evidence that will happen because the U.S. has already used its most powerful weapons, already struck the highest value targets, already applied maximum military pressure, and Iran adapted, dispersed its forces, moved leadership underground, hardened its resolve. Iran is fighting a different kind of war, not trying to win militarily, just trying to survive long enough that the costs of continuing become unbearable for the United States. Rising casualties, soaring energy prices, global economic disruption, diplomatic isolation. Eventually, the pain becomes too great, and the U.S. has to negotiate. That is Iran's strategy, and it is working, which is why Hegseth is desperate to avoid ceasefire talks because a negotiated settlement proves Iran's strategy succeeded. But here is the most disturbing part of Hegseth's statement, Trump's reaction. When asked about Hegseth's comments, Trump did not distance himself, did not clarify that the administration supports diplomacy, did not reassure allies that the U.S. wants peace. Instead, Trump smiled, gave a thumbs up, and said, "I love that attitude. Pete knows we need to finish the job. We cannot stop halfway. That is what weak leaders do. We will keep hitting Iran until they beg for mercy." And I am proud to have a defense secretary who understands that. Trump endorsed Hegseth's position publicly, enthusiastically. The President of the United States just told the world that his administration prefers continued war over negotiated peace, that completing the job matters more than ending the killing, that pride and ego are more important than American lives. This is not strategy. This is vanity. Trump started this war believing it would be quick and decisive. He promised the American people that Iran would collapse within weeks. He compared it to defeating Japan in 1945. Complete and total victory. But Iran did not collapse. And now Trump is trapped, because ending the war through negotiations would mean admitting he was wrong, admitting that his assumptions were false, admitting that maximum pressure failed, and Trump cannot admit failure. So he praises Hegseth for wanting more war, for resisting ceasefire talks, for prioritizing victory over peace, even if that means more American soldiers die, even if that means oil prices stay high and the economy suffers, even if that means the war drags on for months or years, because Trump's ego is more important than any of those costs. But let me tell you what is really happening behind the scenes, because the public statements do not match the private panic. Multiple sources inside the administration have told reporters that there is a growing divide between the Pentagon and the State Department. The Pentagon, led by Hegseth, believes the war can still be won militarily, that more time and more bombing will eventually force Iran to surrender, that negotiations now would waste the progress achieved so far. But the State Department, led by Marco Rubio, sees a different reality. Rubio's diplomats are hearing from allies that the economic costs are unsustainable, that oil prices cannot stay above $90 per barrel for months without triggering a global recession, that the Strait of Hormuz closure is starving Asia of energy and collapsing supply chains, that food prices are spiking and hunger is spreading in the poorest countries, and that America's allies are begging Washington to find a diplomatic solution before the damage becomes irreversible. Rubio reportedly told Trump in a private meeting this week that we need an off-ramp, that the U.S. should take Pakistan's mediation seriously, that a negotiated settlement that freezes Iran's nuclear program and reopens Hormuz would be a significant achievement, that claiming victory and ending the war now would be politically smarter than continuing until the costs become unbearable. But Hegseth opposes this. Hegseth argues that accepting a negotiated settlement would allow Iran Iran to declare victory, that the regime would claim it survived American aggression and use that narrative to consolidate power, that ending the war now would embolden Iran's allies, Russia, China, proxies across the region, that the world would see America as weak, unable to finish what it started. So the divide is clear. State Department wants diplomacy, Pentagon wants war, and Trump is siding with the Pentagon because Trump cares more about looking strong than being smart. But here is the irony. The casualties that Hegseth is willing to accept are not abstractions. They are real Americans with names, with families, with lives that matter. 13 American soldiers are dead. Let me name them, because Hegseth wants to risk more deaths. The least we can do is remember the ones who already died. Sergeant Declan J. Cody, 20 years old, West Des Moines, Iowa, killed in a drone strike on a makeshift facility in Kuwait. M. Jeffrey R. O'Brien, killed in the same strike. Captain Cody A. Cork, Chief Warrant Officer 3, Robert M. Marzan, Sergeant First Class Nicole M. Amore, Sergeant First Class Noah L. Teachout, all killed March 3rd when a Russian satellite tracked their position and an Iranian drone struck their base. 6 more soldiers killed March 18th in an aircraft crash during a refueling operation over Iraq. Not combat deaths, operational deaths caused by exhaustion and the strain of sustaining high-tempo operations for weeks without rest. And one more soldier whose name has not been released pending family notification. 13 Americans dead and 290 wounded, some with injuries so severe they will never fully recover. Lost limbs, traumatic brain injuries, burns, psychological trauma. These are the costs of Hegseth's preferred strategy. Continue the war, keep bombing, risk more American lives, because ending it now would mean accepting less than total victory. And when Trump met with Gold Star families yesterday at Dover Air Force Base, families of soldiers killed in this war, some of them told him, "Finish the job. Do not let our sons and daughters die for nothing." And Trump is using that pain to justify continuation. But those families do not have all the information. They do not know that the job Hegseth wants to finish is regime change in a country of 90 million people. They do not know that finishing could take years and cost thousands more American lives. They do not know that the military objectives are unrealistic and the political goals are unachievable. They just know their children are dead and they want that death to mean something. So they trust Trump, trust Hegseth, trust that continuing the war will produce the victory that justifies the sacrifice. But that trust is being exploited. Now let me explain what negotiations actually look like right now, because despite Hegseth's opposition, talks are happening. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif is mediating. He delivered a 15-point peace plan to Iran this week. The plan, which leaked to media yesterday, includes the following demands. 1. Iran must permanently dismantle all uranium enrichment facilities. 2. Iran must allow international inspectors unlimited access to all suspected nuclear sites. 3. Iran must withdraw all support for proxy forces in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza. 4. Iran must dismantle its ballistic missile program. 5. Iran must reopen the Strait of Hormuz immediately and guarantee safe passage for all commercial shipping. 6. Iran must pay reparations to countries affected by the Hormuz closure. 7. Iran must release all political prisoners and allow freedom of assembly. 8. Iran must hold internationally monitored elections within 6 months. 9. Iran must recognize Israel's right to exist and normalize relations. 10. Iran must extradite all individuals wanted for terrorism by the U.S. and its allies. 11. Iran must accept a permanent U.S. military presence in the Persian Gulf. 12. Iran must cap oil production at levels determined by the U.S. 13. Iran must end all military cooperation with Russia and China. 14. Iran must dissolve the IRGC and integrate all forces under conventional military command. 15. Iran must accept these terms unconditionally with no reciprocal concessions from the United States. Iran's response was immediate and unequivocal. These are not peace terms. These are surrender terms. These demands are maximalist, humiliating, and impossible for any sovereign nation to accept. The United States is not negotiating. It is dictating, and Iran will never submit to dictation. Iran rejected all 15 points, called the plan an insult, and told Pakistan that negotiations are only possible if the U.S. approaches with realistic proposals that acknowledge Iran's sovereignty and legitimate security interests. But the U.S. is not offering realistic proposals because Hegseth does not want realistic proposals. He wants unconditional surrender, and Trump supports that position, which means the negotiations are a charade. The U.S. is going through the motions of diplomacy while actually trying to force Iran to accept terms no country would accept. And when Iran refuses, the U.S. will blame Iran for the failure and use that as justification to continue the war. This is the playbook. Offer impossible terms. Wait for rejection. Claim the enemy is unreasonable. Continue military operations. It is the same pattern the U.S. used in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Vietnam, and it never works. But Hegseth believes it will work this time. And meanwhile, the global costs keep rising. Oil is at $93 per barrel today, down from $115 earlier this week. Markets rallied on hopes that negotiations might succeed, but those hopes are false because Hegseth does not want them to succeed. And when the markets realize negotiations are fake, oil will spike again, possibly higher than before. Gas is $3.91 per gallon nationwide. Americans have spent $4.5 billion more on fuel since this war started. That is money out of family budgets, money that could have paid for groceries, rent, health care, gone, spent on gas because the Strait of Hormuz is closed and global energy markets are in chaos. And Hegseth wants to keep it that way because ending the war would require compromise. The Strait of Hormuz is 80% closed. 2,000 vessels are stranded. 20,000 seafarers trapped on ships that cannot safely transit the Gulf. Some have been stuck for over 3 weeks, running out of supplies, facing mental health crisis, families begging governments to intervene. But intervention requires diplomacy, requires talking to Iran, requires offering something in exchange for reopening the strait. And Hegseth opposes giving Iran anything. So the sailors stay trapped, the ships stay stranded, and the global economy keeps bleeding. Food security is collapsing. The United Nations warned this week that the Hormuz closure is disrupting food supply chains worse than the Ukraine war. Grain shipments stuck, fertilizer blocked, rising energy costs making food production more expensive everywhere. If the strait stays closed another month, the UN estimates global food prices will spike 40%. That means hunger, malnutrition, starvation in the poorest countries. But Hegseth is disappointed by ceasefire prospects because feeding the hungry is less important than achieving total victory. Asia is in crisis. The Philippines declared a 1-year energy emergency. Sri Lanka is switching off streetlights to save 25% energy consumption. Cities going dark because they cannot afford fuel. Factories closing because power is too expensive. Unemployment rising. Economies contracting. And all of this is preventable. All of this could end with a negotiated settlement that reopens Hormuz and freezes Iran's nuclear program. But Hegseth does not want that. He wants unconditional surrender. And Trump praises that attitude. Lebanon is being destroyed. Over 1,094 Lebanese killed, most of them civilians. Israel is bombing without warning, destroying bridges, cutting off entire regions. 1 million people displaced, fleeing their homes as Israel prepares a ground invasion. The humanitarian catastrophe rivals Gaza, and it is accelerating. But none of this matters to Hegseth because Lebanese civilians are not part of his victory calculation. And here is the final insult. The same day Hegseth said he is disappointed by ceasefire prospects. Iran announced it is willing to negotiate not on the 15-point surrender terms, but on realistic proposals. Iran told CNN through back channels that it would consider a deal that includes freezing uranium enrichment at current levels in exchange for sanctions relief, reopening Hormuz in exchange for security guarantees that the U.S. will not attack Iranian energy infrastructure, ending support for some proxy forces in exchange for a regional security framework. That is a negotiating position, not surrender, but an actual basis for talks. And Hegseth rejected it, called it insufficient, said Iran must accept all U.S. demands with no reciprocal concessions. That is not negotiation. That is ultimatum, and it guarantees the war continues. So here we are, day 28. The U.S. Secretary of Defense openly opposes peace. The president praises him for it. 13 American soldiers are dead, 290 wounded, over 3,000 civilians killed across Iran and Lebanon. Global shipping paralyzed, energy prices crushing economies, food security collapsing, and the path to peace is being blocked by ego, by pride, by the refusal to accept anything less than total victory, even when total victory is impossible. Pete Hegseth is disappointed by ceasefire prospects, and that disappointment will cost lives, American lives, Iranian lives, Lebanese lives, lives that could be saved if the U.S. approached negotiations seriously. But serious negotiations require acknowledging reality, acknowledging that Iran survived, that maximum pressure failed, that military force has limits, and Pete Hegseth cannot acknowledge that. So he wants more war. Trump praises that attitude, and the world pays the price. Subscribe and turn on notifications right now because this admission changes everything. The U.S. is not trying to end this war. It is trying to win it completely. And that means the war will continue until either Iran collapses or the costs become so unbearable that Trump has no choice but to negotiate. How many more Americans will die before that happens? How many more months will oil stay above $90? How many people will starve because food shipments are blocked? Hegseth does not care. He is disappointed by peace, and Trump loves that attitude. Day 28, the Secretary of Defense wants war. The President agrees, and the killing continues. Tell me in the comments, is Hegseth right that continuing the war will force Iran to surrender? Or is this ego-driven madness that will only make everything worse? I am Michael Turner, and I will see you in the next update.